Hi, my name is Amanda Seston, and we're going to talk about the neurobiological consequences of maltreatment in mid-childhood during this presentation. Toxic stress in the form of abuse is quite prevalent during childhood in general and middle childhood to be particular. Today I'm going to focus on the mid-childhood years for this lecture. With the many different stage theories, you may ask yourself, what exactly is middle childhood? But according to Mott and Ford Jones 2012, mid-childhood is the developmental age range that lasts from approximately 6 to 12 years old. During this time, developmental changes in the brain, just as in any other developmental stage, is a critical period with lasting effects. But adaptation in this period is integral in brain development and consequent mental and behavioral health. Regarding chronic or toxic stress in the mid-childhood years, the outcome of such adversity must be considered due to the lasting effects adaptation displays later in life, such as adulthood. The research I have provided will discuss structural brain changes, but there are other implications beyond the research findings. For example, the brain serves all aspects of functioning to include learning and memory facilitation and neurochemical regulation, namely cortisol regulation. Or when considering the amygdala, deficits in emotional control may exist. And the examples may lead to poor socialization, poor learning outcomes, externalization disorders, and autoimmune disorders. Bruce, Fisher, Pears, and Levine 2009. But how will such deviance in brain growth affect others and especially offspring? From a theological perspective, sin is a corporate problem affecting all people. And scripture teaches us that by one man's obedience, many were made sinners. Romans 5:18, New International Version. The abuse a child suffers at the hands of another affects him in severe ways, to include learned behavior and lack of skill to address his own parental experiences. Next, we're going to get into the supporting research. Okay, so what we have here sets out to provide evidence in that chronic stress or maltreatment in middle childhood creates structural and brain or chemical brain changes, which leads to psychopathology. Data from several empirical studies reveal that maltreated children who suffered severe abuse in the prepubescent stages of development and who later developed post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD or major depressive order suffered from lower hippocampal volume among other structural deficits compared to control groups. In 1997, Bremner and his colleagues aimed to compare hippocampal volume in participants who suffered abuse in middle childhood, which then led to PTSD against normal healthy controls not having suffered abuse or having PTSD. The authors hypothesized that patients with a history of childhood abuse would have a smaller volume of the hippocampus, but not of other comparison brain structures in comparison to their matched controls. Brummer et al. 1997, page 24. They found left hippocampal volume to be 12% smaller than those persons in the control group and found significant deficits in verbal memory. Similar to Bremner's findings, DeBellis et al. 1999 found alterations in stress systems that led to adverse brain development. Again, we find that abused children who develop PTSD suffer physiologically. And furthermore, DeBellis and his colleagues found lower levels of functioning, more suicidal ideations, greater childhood ratings of depression, and greater parental ratings of internalizing and externalizing symptoms. This takes us to the Kaufman et al. Study, which focused on abused children with an externalizing disorder. In 1997, Kaufman et al. Attempted to show that abused and depressed children have altered hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis function. The HPA axis is our central stress response system, where the hypothalamus releases the corticotropin releasing hormone, in which that same CRH binds to the appropriate receptor, leading to the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone. Ultimately, this leads to cortisol release and contributes to homeostasis, habituation, and adaptation. In the case for abused and depressed children, they display significantly greater baseline ACTH and greater total and net ACTH secretion post CRH than the depressed, abused children currently living in stable environments. the depressed non-abused, and the normal controlled children. Kaufman et al., 1997, page 675. So far, we've seen a relationship between abuse, PTSD, depression, and adverse physiological changes. The Vithillingham et al. Study in 2002 continues in this pattern with its exploration of histories of childhood trauma and its relations to hippocampal volume and depression. They found that women who repeatedly suffered childhood abuse and were currently depressed had an 18% reduction in left hippocampal volume on average. To address some of the mixed findings in past literature, Vithillingham et al. Suggested that prepubescent maltreatment led to morphological abnormalities in the hippocampus as an adult, which is why some children do not show smaller hippocampal volumes. It is also important to note that PTSD was more prevalent in the abused group with major depressive disorder by Thillingham et al. 2002, page 2075. Okay, so finally, we are going to discuss an empirical meta-analysis that synthesizes the literature of its time. Okay, so Woon and Hedges in 2008 conducted a meta-analysis that aimed to analyze published data of hippocampal and amygdala volumes in children and adults who suffered through childhood abuse and its subsequent PTSD to establish etiology of structural volumetric changes. They actually did not find significant findings in the left, right, or total hippocampal volumes. However, they did find significant reductions in the left and right hippocampal volumes in an adult PTSD group, which validates the Vithillingham et al. Findings and suggestions in that childhood maltreatment leads to adult PTSD and causes adverse hippocampal development in the interim of childhood and adulthood. So there's the difference. Okay, so regardless of etiological factors, it is important to address traumatic experience before PTSD sets in as an adult. So now that we have a good grasp on the research and their findings, let's discuss their implications with some more depth. An important and shared extrapolation across many of the studies suggests that the developmental period itself may be crucial in determining if adversity will predict lower hippocampal volume in adulthood. In later development, where neuronal plasticity continues to decrease, structural damage may increase as traumatic events are introduced. So consequently, it would be beneficial to study the relationship between developmental periods and childhood trauma. In addition, further implications from the findings suggest that the proposed etiology of lowered hippocampal volume should help to shape clinical treatment of PTSD and other affective disorders. And finally, Kaufman et al. 1997 concludes by listing experiential factors, ongoing stressors, and lack of positive supports as determining factors for dysregulation of the HPA axis. Now, it is widely accepted that positive supports in the form of secure relationships are necessary to a healthy and normal development, Clinton and Sibsey, 2006, and may provide a cushion to traumatic events. So again, this should inform future research and therapeutic endeavors. DeBellis et al. 1999 discusses possible explanations for volume size and concludes that chronically stressful and impoverished living conditions may contribute to volume size. So this should speak politically towards social advancement and helping programs that cater to children and families regarding priority and financial budgets. So each of the 5 journal articles discuss PTSD, various forms of depression, brain structure volume, namely lowered hippocampal and increased amygdala volume, and the various yet similar implications of findings. Ultimately, it can be said that those who have suffered childhood maltreatment in the form of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, and who suffer with its consequential adulthood PTSD or depression, have reductions in hippocampal volume along with other stunted or damaging structural and chemical changes in the brain as adults. The literature provided several practical implications and applications of their findings, but the ideas that hold the most prevalence deal with clinical treatment and preventative care for PTSD and other affective disorders in children who have suffered abuse, especially while still suffering abuse. So, if in fact hippocampal growth is stunted after exposure to abuse and therefore adverse stress and leads to PTSD or other disorders, And if in fact there are mitigating factors that lead to PTSD versus other affective disorders, then it would be wise to develop treatment plans based on such evidence. The differences in etiology should help to shape treatment plans and therefore be more helpful and productive for the person suffering. It would be wise to consider social programming that focuses on helping families who are likely to suffer from or engage in abuse and therefore alleviate generational consequences. And in the future, it would be helpful to employ a longitudinal study in our educational systems sometime in the high school years that focus on psychological education and parental training for all teens with the goal of changing the outlook on child abuse and therefore societal health. Lastly, here we have the references. Thanks for listening and good luck with your presentations.